Well, I'm actually surprised to see that we have new Protest the Hero. For a while there, I just kind of gave up hope, but hey, I mean, we've had a lot of surprises from outfits that we weren't quite sure we were ever going to see new material of. So, yeah, I've got some things to say. I got some things to say. So let's dive into this one.
Amelia, please don't go. Just stay. Don't go.
Palimpest, I think that's how you pronounce this one, by Protest the Hero. So, Protest the Hero, a Ontario-Canadian band, tech death metal, or I guess extreme tech. They're not really death metal. They're a blending between this kind of punky, raw energy with very sophisticated, complex playing styles, and it all comes together in very, very fun times. Now, I was really getting into these guys probably around the 2013, 2014 time when Violation came out. And I had heard Fortress when it first came out back in like 2008, and I didn't gravitate to them. After Violation came out, I was exposed a little bit more to the tech metal side of things with Opeth and Devin Townsend and Animals as Leaders and all those other very proggy metal outfits had cleansed my palate enough that I could actually dive in and understand what these guys were talking about. So Palimpest is either their fifth or sixth studio release, however you want to cut it. They did release Pacific Myth in 2015 as kind of like a Patreon album where they released one track every month or every week or something like that until they had like a full-length album, and then they released the whole thing for everybody. And in between all this, we had Rhodey Walker, the main vocalist and singer off of the band, have really strenuous throat problems, and they actually had to cancel a tour because of this. I wasn't really expecting any new music from Protest the Hero for quite a while, and they said that a new one was in the works. On the one hand, I can see how that work that had been put into this had paid off, and the things that they did to help Rhodey ease himself back into this singing, because it's a very strenuous singing style that he's adopted. It's very screaming, it's very growling, it's very yelling. You know, there's not too many past albums that had clean vocals on it. And if there were, it was very, very few and far between. It's usually always screaming or yelling in some way, shape, or form. That is definitely toned down on this album. All that lead up. Now we're actually talking about the album. A lot of that is left to the wayside. There's still a lot of screaming and yelling going on for Rhodey, but it's subdued. It's not quite as in your face. And I've seen a few people comment that it's kind of like a James LeBray from Dream Theater after he had his issues with his throat and his vocals. I don't quite think it's to that extent, because at no point do I find Rhodey's singing to be embarrassing. At no point do I feel like it's too much or too little, or that he's reaching or anything like that. I feel like he did the right thing to kind of shift the focus a little bit. So, I mean, there's still a number of yelling and screaming, but it's not the forefront. So I want to kind of get this point out of the way to begin with, because for me, this is kind of the biggest talking point from the album. The album structure as a whole is a little bit of a mess. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't provide a very cohesive listen. It does to a certain extent, but they had this really, really interesting idea of having all these mini songs throughout the album. And maybe, I mean, I'm looking at the runtime on the Prog Archives, and it doesn't quite match the runtime on Spotify. They have all of these little interludes throughout the album. So you've got Harborside, you've got Mountainside, and you've got Hillside. And what I like about these tracks is that they really help structure the album in terms of having these different sides and the music that blends throughout it. And I think this was a really, really good idea, because the first three tracks, The Migrant Mother, The Canary, and From the Sky, are my three favorite tracks. They open up the doors, they introduce this new playing style, and I also love how a few of these songs kind of bleed into one another. Very much The Canary and From the Skies, and I'll talk about a few other ones when we get deeper into the album. But I also like how right from The Migrant Mother, we have a little bit more emphasis on texturing and layering of sounds outside of just bombastic, there's that word again, guitar styles. Like, it's not just Luke and Tim blowing down the doors within their guitars. There's a lot of orchestral arrangements, and that's actually provided by Milan Pretzel Soras, I think it is, Pretzel Soras, where we have this synthesizer or orchestral movements that are helping to really structure and placate the actual track itself. This is especially found in the track of From the Sky, and I love how we have those really soaring like arrangement that helps structure this track into being something really, really interesting. Like both the Migrant Mother and From the Sky have these really fun and light moments on very heavy tracks that allow us to get more into that tech metal that Protest the Hero is really, really well known for. Now, I've already talked about The Canary in my track review. You can find it up there. And I still love The Canary. It's one of my favorite tracks off this album. And then we come into Harborside, which is a really nice kind of transition into this next point of the album where we go into All Hands, The Fireside, Soliloquy, and Revere. And I like the fact that Soliloquy and Revere blend really well together. It feels very similar to the transition that we had from The Canary into From the Skies. And that transition, that passing the baton, was so smooth. And it actually elevates Revere to such a higher standing. I like All Hands. It's a very traditional protest song. It's something that I would have heard off of Violition or Skrillex, or however you want to call it. There's nothing too much to write home about All Hands, though. It does have an infectious chorus when we have that all hands, all hands, all hands. And I thought that was really interesting. But after the three really knocker-outers of the first three tracks, All Hands just kind of seems, I don't know, a little bit less exciting to me. But the momentum still goes, and I think Fireside is one of the first tracks that I start to withdraw from the album itself. Like, I'm not feeling that much of a punch anymore. I'm not feeling all that much more engaged. I mean, it has a really nice build-up at the end point of the track. Still, it wasn't quite enough for me to get drawn back into the track. I just didn't feel all that much about it. And then the next track, as I mentioned with Soliloquy, very much like the Fireside, I feel like the first half is a climb to the final like minute of this track where Rhodey is really singing it out in a very clean style. I'm really loving the end point of this track, which is the one that actually brings us right into Reverie, but I'm not quite as drawn out as I was from Fireside. And maybe because Fireside ended with a really high note, it perked my interest for when Soliloquy started. Then I'm getting more engaged with the track, and it leads to a very beautiful end piece. And I love the emotion that Rhodey is pouring into the track at the end point. The guitars aren't quite as just like bombarding you as much. And I really like how they play it out a little bit more in that sense. And Reverie, as I mentioned, as Reverie opens up, it is just a punch to the face, and they hit the ground running in this track. They use all the momentum from Soliloquy into this track, and it just really ushers through to the next piece. Now, with Little Snakes, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of Little Snakes, which is weird because it does follow a lot of the same issues that some of the other tracks do, where it opens up very heavy, really fast-paced, really go, 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 or racing to the finish line kind of an idea. And then it ends and it has these moments that build the song up and has this really interesting play out that I really like. But I think because it's followed up by almost 4 tracks that do the exact same thing, I'm not as engaged in it as much as it is. And I think Little Snakes, I always want to call it Baby Snakes from Frank Zappa, but Little Snakes is kind of that first track that I'm like, oh, I'm not sure I'm as engaged in this album as I really want to be. Now, that being said, Mountainside is a great kind of interlude. I like the ebb and flow within that. And Gardenias is still a very interesting and fun track. I don't really have too much to say about it. It does follow what I've mentioned before. It has a really nice build up near the midpoint to a really great play out at the end. Hillside does another great job of providing a nice interlude. When we get to Rivette it's fine. But I feel like an ending track, it doesn't really hit me all that well. It doesn't really get me where I want it to. And so, yeah, like overall, I think like this album, on the one hand, is a little bit of a mess. I really want to know their justification of putting these side pieces throughout the album in the way that they did. Like, I think it's a brilliant idea, but I don't think they really captured... I don't think they utilized it very, very well, if I'm being perfectly honest. If they had moved Mountainside up so that it included Baby Snakes, and then moved All Hands to be the first track after Mountainside as opposed to the first track after Harborside, I think it could have been a really well-structured and a really beautiful listen from start to finish. As it is, it's still a really nice listen, but it is a little bit disjointed when we have the first 3 songs be so punchy and so powerful. Having a nice interlude, and then having about like 5 tracks just go one after the other, after the other, after the other, and then having Mountainside, and then Gradient being its own little island, and then Hillside, and then Rivet being the final track. It was such a strange choice. It was such a strange choice. Anyway, as it stands, I still really enjoyed this album. I still got quite a bit of enjoyment out of it. I still return to this album, and the more I listen to it, the more I find myself really digging it. This probably isn't as good as, say, Fortress or Keza, but it's probably on par with Violation and Pacific Myth. And I would probably listen to this one before I listen to Violation again. So that kind of goes there, because even though this album doesn't have, say, songs that are as good as Clarity or Mist from Violation, the tracks never get as low as some of the lower tracks from Violation do. And similarly, those tracks that do hit really hard hit extremely hard. So, yeah. In the end, still love this album. Great addition to the Protest catalog. This is one that I would probably, this is hard, because I'm wavering between download and pick it up in physical format. I'm kind of splitting hairs between that, right? So it's probably going to be a download for me. Hopefully, as the summer goes on, it will get a little bit better. But as it is right now, I'm going to stick to a download, just because that mid section is a little bit of a slog. And I don't feel as connected to that midsection as I really wanted to. So that's about it for Palimpest from Protest the Hero. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.